right, GM farmers, I think that for today, a lot of what we wanted to cover is in the context of markets that we should be building on top of Beanstalk, and hopefully getting as specific as possible to sort of better inform whether we should be using existing tech like Seaport. I think Breen has been doing some research on that end, versus to what extent, bespoke software like Tractor is necessary to be built, audited, etc., in order to support all these markets that we do want to build on top of Beanstalk. So perhaps, Publius, think it would be helpful if you help us get into the weeds a bit on what all the things that you think we should be covering today.
B, you want to kick us off or you want me to?
Go ahead.
All right. So Beanstalk has some base assets. At the moment, it has Beans, which are an ERC20 token, pods, which don't adhere or don't implement any ERC standard at the moment, fertilizer, which is an 1155 token, and then deposits, which also do not adhere to any ERC standard at the moment. And as of the last DAO call, there was a lot of discussion around the implementation of pods and deposits as 1155 tokens. And in short, the question becomes, independent of whether or not pods and deposits are implemented as 1155 tokens, there's all of this exchange, let's call it software being implemented or smart contracts being implemented to facilitate the exchange of various assets. And some of the stuff like Wells is starting with just ERC20 tokens, but Tractor / Seaport, the latest version of Seaport, which Fushi made us aware of on one of the recent dev calls, can already support effectively arbitrary orders, or at least in theory should be able to support arbitrary orders for 1155, 721s, and ERC20s. And so, in short, the main topic of conversation, it probably is helpful to get into today, is around which of the markets around any of the Beanstalk native assets it is most helpful to facilitate a market forming on top, or a DEX forming on top of for given assets. And so what we'd like to cover today is running through some of the different options for markets and what implementing those markets might look like, and then the potential trade-offs to Beanstalk and the trade-offs around developing any of those markets in the particular order, and then hopefully trying to get some clarity on which are the markets that make the most sense to start working on. So that's maybe the starting point. We'll maybe just pause to see if people have any questions or thoughts to begin with, and then otherwise we can start talking about more specific market implementations worth considering.
Not a specific question, but on this end, would like to better understand. So, given that the pod market is the first market that we built on Beanstalk, would like to better understand in what ways it'd be made better, more efficient, etc., by the use of something like Seaport or Tractor.
So if we start with the pod marketplace, which is where Beanstalk Farms effectively started, there was, and to some extent continues to be, some inefficiency in the secondary market for Beanstalk debt. And because pods do not implement any ERC standard, in particular, there was no way to exchange pods in a permissionless setting. So the pod marketplace V1 facilitated the exchange of pods through the Beanstalk contract in exchange for beans. So you could list a plot for a given amount of beans. And similarly, you could place an order with beans for some pods. And because pods are ordered, all of the orders to buy or sell could include some parameter around the place in line. So an order would be an order to buy pods up to a certain place in line at a given price. And similarly, an offer to sell would be to sell a plot at a price until the harvestable index reached a certain amount. And what that facilitated was statically priced orders denominated in beans per pod. Now, there's an obvious inefficiency around static orders because, in theory, if what you're willing to pay for a pod at one point in the line is not the same price as what you'd be willing to pay for a pod at another point in the line. And so in practice, in order to create any sort of dynamic curve in the pod marketplace, you'd have to place a significant amount of orders, which is very expensive. So pod marketplace V2, which was largely implemented by Maltese, supported polynomial functions such that you could place an order for a set of pods or to list a plot along some pricing curve where the price in terms of beans per pod is a function of the place in line. And that is a potentially very significant improvement to the efficiency of the pod marketplace. But as of now, there is no UI to support that. And so it's not particularly used, and therefore the economic efficiency around or the benefits potentially gained from the pod marketplace V2 have not necessarily been realized. Now, to answer your question, Guy, around what a V3 might look like and how that fits into the conversation today and what are the additional benefits you could get from a V3 implemented on Tractor/Seaport, is that you could now potentially offer deposits for pods or fertilizer for pods. I think deposits for pods is the most interesting one, certainly, because whereas currently, in order to place an order for pods on V1 or V2, the marketplace only accepts beans. And the concept is that, therefore, you need to forfeit all of the stock and potential bean seniorage accrued while the beans are in an order for the pods. And there's obviously some inefficiency there around creating liquidity. So the concept of a V3 and something that is introduced by something like Tractor/Seaport is the ability to basically bid or place orders for arbitrary assets against arbitrary assets. So in this case, it could be deposits implemented as an 1155 for pods implemented as an 1155. And that order could be similar to how V2 works, be a function of the place in line, but the assets themselves can change. So you can do away with the economic inefficiency around only being able to offer beans in orders. Now, this sort of lends itself to the larger conversation, which is Tractor/Seaport facilitate off-chain orders, which can be significantly more complex in nature with less on-chain development, but are particularly complicated to support at the UI level. And so there is really an explicit conversation around what markets, assuming that there's going to be a pod marketplace V3 implemented on Tractor/Seaport, there's a lot of open questions around creating a user interface around that can support whatever the the pair is that the V3 is supposed to highlight, or pairs, which is going to be a significant task. And it's highlighted by the fact that there still isn't a V2 UI. So the concept is, part of the point of having this conversation is around trying to decide some sort of tier list around priority for markets that could be built on Tractor or Tractor / Seaport. And again, still just not sure which whether Seaport ultimately has all the functionality necessary. So still not sure whether it'll be Tractor or Seaport. But the concept is figuring out which are the products, the actual exchanges that it is in the interest of Beanstalk to facilitate is really the goal of today's call. Did that answer your question, guys? Sorry for the long-winded answer.
It did. That was great. So I guess one question that came to mind is I assume, like, at the contract level, Tractor or Seaport would not prevent someone from ordering pods with a shitcoin, but your point is at the UI level, when you want to, facilitate, a particular user experience, like, it obviously would not be worthwhile to support making orders with that token. And it would be worthwhile potentially making the ability to create orders with deposited beans, for example.
It certainly adds a lot of
what you're getting
to
at?
add a shitcoin pod pair, let's call it, and minimal benefit to Beanstalk per se. So yeah, that is explicitly the thing we're talking about, is what are the things worth, building trading pairs for, or exchange pairs for, that will help the Beanstalk ecosystem, or help Beanstalk explicitly. So what are the exchanges using Tractor / Seaport that are most important or most beneficial to Beanstalk for us to collectively try to implement?
And just so I understand, when it comes to development work, like if we're talking about building a pod market such that you can order pods with deposited beans, like, what would be the additional development cost of adding support for ordering pods with USDC, for example? Is it nothing? Is it some amount? Just asking because I have no idea. Or is all the work in your mind at that point at the UI level?
I think Chad might be better suited to comment on the complexity of supporting deposits for pods versus, like, call it a set of 5 assets for pods. But think that from an economics perspective, separate from a technical perspective, and we'll yield to Chad in just a second on that front. From an economics perspective, there is some sense of value in having multiple pairs, but there's still being some fragmentation of liquidity. And I guess in theory, if you have a great aggregator for all this stuff, then for like a normal market participant or a taker, that it shouldn't really harm them that the liquidity is fragmented. But that would add a significant amount of complexity on the UI level per se. Although there will, over time, there is probably some need for a complex aggregator to be implemented, but that probably is, that's getting significantly ahead of ourselves here. But curious for what others think.
With regards to the markets, I think stock marketplace, or deposit / stock marketplace, fertilizer, and then the pod marketplace.
That's your tier list, Mod?
I think so, yeah, because all of these are secondary markets for Beanstalk or Beanstalk, assets. So I think those would be the first ones, or the low-hanging fruits. It makes just every like Beanstalk asset a little bit more liquid.
And what do you think are the pairs that should be supported?
So I think my understanding is that the main advantage by making these markets more liquid is because of the reduced transaction fees in creating the offers, correct? So we can expect people to create more offers a lot more cheaper, and that would, in theory, make the markets more liquid. Is my understanding correct?
Not sure I'm following you there.
So my understanding is that, first off, Tractor and OpenSea allow for kind of, asynchronous order creation and order indexing, which means that the orders don't necessarily have to be stored on mainnet. This is just one of the byproducts of, something like Tractor or Seaport. It should also be mentioned that, it makes it very easy to create one of N orders, where you can, say create 5, 6 different orders, and basically have some, all of these orders can be created cheaply, potentially free, depending on the indexing solution. And then, say someone executes one of them and fulfills it, it can automatically have the other orders be canceled. So the system allows for very modular, kind of order creation and, kind of, very easy to make kind of orders dynamic in that sense, but kind of every single complication made at the order level, is going to introduce, more complexity at the indexer/UI level, as, every single kind of, bell or whistle that might be added to an order ultimately needs to be deciphered at some point, and that's, both deciphered from this is some arbitrary abstract data perspective. The indexer needs to now create some sort of structure to that, and then at the UI level, it needs to be able to kind of display the structured data. So it's like with new markets comes complexity at the indexer and UI level. And ultimately kind of, it's kind of, given that, I think, Maud, you picked a great starting place talking about pods, deposits, and fertilizer. But ultimately there'll need to be some sort of consideration made around, what is the scope of, kind of everything that you can pair against pods. Now, it should be noted that, say I'm willing to sell my pods for beans. I mean, I guess like, I want to sell my pods for USDC. There are kind of two options here. Option one is someone just sells USDC into my plot. Option two is someone sells beans into my plot, and then, the beans are kind of automatically dumped into USDC. Now that can happen as a part of the order fulfillment, or it could happen kind of after the fact as I, as a user, want to sell. There are plenty of ways we can make this complicated, but I think, it's important to have a strong basis on what the, what the community seems to agree as, kind of the minimal viable implementation that still allows for economic efficiency.
Do you want to comment substantively on the concept of having orders for pods in a variety of different tokens and the additional workload that would add for a single market?
Yeah, I mean, not going to speak on, not going to speak in detail on the UI level, as quite frankly, that isn't my area of expertise. On the back end level, it's not necessarily too difficult. I mean, it's already possible, right? You create 5 different orders, potentially, where I can, or you can either create one massive order where it's like, I'm willing to trade pods for USDC or beans or Bitcoin or ETH or DAI. And so long as the user pays me some amount of any, or some combination of those tokens evaluated against some oracle that I also include in the order, basically willing to sell my plot. Kind of an alternative to that would be to create 5 different orders where it's like, now I have an order to sell this plot for USDC, in order to sell it for Bean, in order to sell it to ETH, in order to sell it for Bitcoin. And, kind of there's some sort of contract that's summating the total amount of pods sold. And or there's just, I'm willing to sell the whole plot, at which case it's like, if I no longer have the plot, none of these orders are valid. From an indexing perspective, or I guess the downside to the second solution is that, it requires a signature for each different order. This is only really a hindrance at the user experience level, where it's like, if I'm creating 5 different orders, I now have to, say I'm using a Trezor. I now have to sign 5 different things on my Trezor. I have to verify that I'm signing something legitimate. It's what I expected. I think with Tractor, if the decision is made to use Tractor, there is potential optionality for the ability to sign a list of orders at one time. We can improve the user experience that way. But kind of the point is, from the back end, there are multiple ways to do it. The back end already kind of supports it with different trade-offs, both at, gas efficiency of executing, fulfilling the order, and, kind of how the user experience for that sort of order creation goes. But kind of what's most substantive is, kind of the effect on indexing. It's quite clear that kind of, the UI market and the indexer are the two bigger coding challenge, or the 2 bigger pieces of technology that need to be built here. And from the indexer level, it seems like the less custom functionality, the better. Meaning, the indexer will somehow need to be able to decode every single function selector that's used. So, kind of from the indexer perspective, minimizing kind of the set of possible function selectors, makes the indexing task simpler. Now, getting back to the idea of, you want to encode one large order that says Beans or USDC or ETH or etc. That makes it a lot harder for the indexer to process, as now it needs to do some like OR condition where it's assessing all 5 of them. It needs to have like some conditional Oracle variable where it's like calculating the price of Bean and ETH, Bitcoin, USDC all simultaneously, versus if it individually supports the ability to do trade, kind of the plot USDC pair, the plot BTC pair, the plot USDC pair, etc. It makes this question, it makes it simpler from the perspective of, that logic already exists. Let's just add support for a new token type. Now, I guess one important consideration to make, especially as, we're talking about non-stable tokens. For instance, someone is willing to buy, pods with ETH. My guess would be that, there's some desire to denominate the price they're willing to pay for the pods, or that they want to have the pods paid for in stable currency. And it's like, if I'm saying, I want to buy or sell, I want to sell these pods into ETH. Now it's like you have to specify some Oracle price. From this perspective, like there needs to be some Oracle, some ETH USDC Oracle on chain that is used to calculate the payment that the user ultimately has to pay for. Like that's where it starts to get complex. As now it's like, the UI would need to evaluate some Oracle for this given order, and, think if it can be kind of generally, again, getting to the point of the indexer problem. The indexer can be expanded to include more function selectors as time goes on, but when really thinking about a minimal viable set of function selectors, kind of getting into the Oracle territory might be getting complicated. but I guess it's kind of inevitable if multiple tokens are to be supported. Because from like a UI perspective, if I only have beans and someone has an open order that they're willing to sell pods only for USDC, there's a potential route where I sell my beans into USDC and buy the pods. And if that is cheaper than the cheapest order to sell a plot similar in caliber to that one in beans, then it should kind of the UI needs to somehow abstract away the fact that the sell from beans to USDC is happening. So ultimately it's like this can get as complex as is desired, and used in combination with pipeline, think the possibilities are quite infinite. So maybe kind of perhaps narrowing the scope to at most a few currencies would probably make it an easier task. I mean, narrowing the scope to just beans will make it probably easier overall, especially from the UI perspective, as now it doesn't need to potentially denominate things in multiple different currencies. Those are kind of my thoughts on the topic. But curious to hear kind of how important people might think it is for those. I mean, because it's like, I guess from the fulfiller's perspective, right? If I'm fulfilling your order, let's say you're buying a plot for beans, and I, as a user, want USDC. It's very easy for me to fulfill that transaction and sell, or fulfill that order and sell my beans into USDC in the same transaction. So the fact that the offer was only created to be denominated in beans isn't necessarily a problem, because through pipeline you can just sell before or after, for some liquidity fee and extra gas costs. Now, if I'm the order creator, let's say I'm selling a plot and an order for beans, there doesn't seem to be any natural synchronous way to automatically sell once my order is fulfilled. I mean, and think that functionality would either warrant kind of the actual selling of beans into USDC in the order itself, where it's like my order is willing to create the sell order. I mean, I guess it would probably make sense for the person creating the order to denominate the order in the currency they want, and it's kind of up to the fulfiller to figure out the path to see how they actually get that currency. So if I want USDC, kind of, if I create the order to be fulfilled in bean, given that I'm not the one creating the transaction, I'm not going to have control over execution flow to have it automatically sell into bean when the order is fulfilled. Meaning I'm probably going to be left with bean unless that sell is encoded in the order. But encoding a sell in an order seems like quite overly complicated, whereas from my perspective, I'm probably better off just saying, I want USDC, and leaving it up to the fulfiller to perform the sell of beans into USDC, and they just send me the USDC. So it's like, from a perspective of, trying to match the output, it seems like it probably makes sense to leave that up to the fulfiller. But, ultimately, like, it gets back to the question of like, I guess how complex that is from an SDK UI perspective to build out functionality for situations like that, where, we obviously want every user to be able to fulfill any open order in one transaction. So it's like, to implement some sort of, sell and fulfill atomically, would be very helpful from that perspective.
So to me, I think that's very helpful context on the complexity of the development itself. Maybe then to talk about what pairs make sense. It would make sense to first talk about which would be economically beneficial to Beanstalk. I mean, the deposited beans for pods, seems like low-hanging fruit and makes a lot of sense intuitively. I guess if you, like in the case of selling plots for USDC, I guess I could see a couple different ways of explaining it, where maybe that person only wants the USDC and wouldn't sell otherwise, but it's hard to see how that benefits Beanstalk directly. I don't know. What do people think is the right way to think about that in terms of what pairs would benefit Beanstalk?
The more accepted assets, the more liquid the asset or the pods become. I think maybe for simplicity, just beans, and if we want to expand it, then whitelisted assets. So whatever gets whitelisted is also one of the assets that can be used, and I think more or less this will capture the markets we're interested in.
When you say whitelisted assets, do you mean deposits?
Yeah, like for now, it's like 3-curve. Once we have Bean ETH,
Well, 3-curve is
then
different than like being 3-curve LP tokens in the silo, right? Those are
Yeah, yeah.
different assets. So are you
Yeah, no,
suggesting that we do 3-curve, or are you suggesting that we do Bean 3-curve LP tokens that are deposited in the silo? Or are you suggesting Bean 3-curve LP tokens, which is actually what's on the whitelist?
No, like the asset itself, 3-curve itself, ETH. So you can put offers or place offers on ETH when ETH is whitelisted.
But when you say
And
ETH is whitelisted, what does that mean?
like now we have a Bean ETH pool in the silo.
But the whitelisting is technically around the Bean ETH LP token.
Yeah, I understand. My thinking is just like implicitly, if we're whitelisting a certain asset, then we value that asset. I understand the technicality that we're whitelisting an LP token, not the asset itself. But when you're doing that, my thinking is that this automatically will means that to a certain extent we are valuing that other asset, and hence we may also accept it to place orders, or we allow it to be used to place orders. This is my thinking, but like there is no like science behind it.
Chad, do you have thoughts on the complexity of the number of assets that would be supported against pods? And in particular, ERC20 versus 1155s?
I think a lot of it comes down to how the design side shakes out there. But I think that to get a good technical understanding of what it's going to
Design
look
side
like,
of what?
like what does the UI end up actually looking like for trading both of those against pods?
Can you help us understand why that is important to understand? Like an indexing complexity perspective?
Well, it's hard to give an accurate measurement here. All I can say, or what I can say, is that I think, for example, like we've talked a lot in the past about, various forms of charts or sort of like general interfaces to trade between different assets. If that kind of interface applies in this case, I think that may bump up the development time pretty significantly. If there's some sort of, fusion across multiple assets, like earlier you were talking about aggregation. If there's UI side aggregation, that might do that. I think, very simply just displaying the order book is probably not that complicated from a UI perspective, and it really comes down to what the indexing looks like. And I think the indexing question is downstream of the tractor versus Seaport angle to some extent, though it seems like from our preliminary research that the architecture is somewhat the same, or at least in the same ballpark.
So it seems like at the moment you don't have strong opinions on how additional pairs against a given Beanstalk native asset adds to the complexity, and it seems more like how complex the UI is going to be the main determinant thereof. Is that correct?
I think that's right, though I would caveat that different asset types, ERC20 versus 721 versus 1155, probably greatly increases the complexity. So I think that constraining those would make a lot of sense. Obviously, in the case of pods, I think, we've talked about bean deposits as kind of the asset to support. There's an active discussion going on right now about making bean deposits ERC 1155 compatible, in which case, we might be able to support 1155s more generally by focusing on that as the other side of the market from pods. We've also talked about making pods ERC 1155 compatible. So, that's an example of where if we do those changes, which obviously have their own, their own requirements and relate more to the architecture on the Beanstalk side as it stands, it would probably be easier to support or to develop the market rather than having to develop two new interfaces for, one that talks to deposits and one that talks to pods.
So with all this said, do people have which markets are a priority?
Just want to add to what Chad was saying. I think supporting 1155s against 1155s, just totally from a user interface perspective, will be difficult. I think 1155s to 20s will be, and even arbitrary 20s is a lot easier than doing 1155s against 1155s. So that's not, an opinion on what I think is higher priority, just sort of adding to Chad's point there.
I have a related question. Once stock and seeds are liquid, what is it about deposits or bean deposits or either that are semi-fungible at that point?
It's the obligation to be able to burn a certain amount of seed in stock in exchange for the underlying token.
Makes sense.
And I guess on this topic of what assets to support, like from my perspective, one of the big, one of the very important, things to take into consideration here is, that kind of these order books enable deposits to be used, and think it's very important to make the BDV of a siloed deposit and the Bean ERC20 token very interchangeable. And again, there are numerous ways to do this from an interface perspective, but kind of the goal is to one thing that would really benefit Beanstalk is to be able to kind of abstract away deposits from the orders, and I guess that's not quite clear what that means, but it seems important to be able to enable the use of deposits and the Bean ERC20 token interchangeably, such that if I have Bean deposits and I'm creating orders, if I'm creating orders to buy plots, that it's very easy for the user selling into me to be able to sell that plot, kind of into beans, or vice versa, where, if I'm willing to buy a plot, whether I buy the plot with beans or deposits, it doesn't really matter. And, the end user is able to get which asset they prefer of the two, the actual raw deposit, meaning it withdraws and transacts in beans, or if the goal is to transact in beans, or if the goal is to transact in posits, and at that point it's like, it probably just transfers the deposit, or deposits the beans, and uses the deposit to buy the plot or something. But from this perspective, it's like, the pod marketplace is going to open up a lot of liquidity in the form of, now bean deposits and bean 3 curve deposits in the silo can be used pretty frictionlessly in orders to buy plods or buy fertilizer. And making sure that users, who are using the pod marketplace with beans are able to access all of the liquidity that is existing in the form of, deposits, is quite beneficial.
So want to dig a little bit more into Sweet Red Beans was talking about around the complexity of supporting 1155s against 1155s. Obviously, given the somewhat arbitrary nature of 1155s, it'll be hard to get to a totally generalized implementation at the UI level. But what about like starting with deposits for pods pair, and then sort of working backwards from there to add potentially other 1155s if necessary, but feel like deposits and pods are economically a major step up from other, like, call it ERC20s against pods, and therefore curious for your thoughts on how complicated that makes it, and how that factors into which markets to build first.
Yeah, I guess if I could. I think so, and this is mostly thinking in terms of the pod marketplace that we spent some time trying to build the charting for, but I'm sort of imagining like there's probably a simple user interface to let people exchange deposits for plots. But I think if you really want to enable sort of the efficient pricing here, like I have a hard time imagining how to display like they're both assets sort of change in value depending on position. Like pods, the place in line, and deposits, the season deposited. And so I guess I have a hard time imagining how to sort of display that in a digestible way to let somebody discover the right pricing there. So, and maybe I just need to spend some more time thinking about it, or somebody else has good ideas here, but it's a little bit easier when one asset has a fixed price and is fungible. But I think when they're both semi-fungible, it's difficult to imagine like a sort of good way to display this. I'm not sure if that makes sense or if that lands.
So when it comes to 1155s being liquid in general, like in the case of this deposit plot pair, does like if the pair cares about both the stock and seeds associated with the deposit and the place in line of the plot, does that not inherently fragment liquidity? Or is that the wrong way to think about it? And the point is, like, any taker would have the option to care or not care about one or the other, like the semi-fungibility of either side.
So a lot of this depends on how it's ultimately implemented, but to some extent, it's worth considering the difference between the efficient stock is liquid versus illiquid, in the sense that the real difference in a deposit for a given season, I guess in addition to the underlying asset that is whitelisted and deposited, is the stock per BDV. And so what would really be, in a perfect world, is that the deposits themselves are still abstracted away from the user to a large extent, and there's some premium or bonus denominated in stock that is factored into the order. So there's an axis, and then there's a stock or stock per BDV axis. They're the same thing, and the concept there is that you basically get to the point where the orders can start to be, only two-dimensional on the deposit side. So currently, point guy right now, if you're doing deposits, you actually do have fragmentation by season, because each season a token, and then you've got a bunch of different seasons, and then other assets. So you have a ton of fragmentation. So economically, the real way to get around this is some abstraction through stock liquidity, if that makes sense. So I read your comments on market complexity, economically, how it would probably make the most.
So if I understand you correctly, you're saying that you would abstract out the well, I guess you would be measuring the BDV of the deposit, and you'd be displaying it as a trade. With I guess it would sort of function like a 1155 and an ERC20, at least at the UI level, and you would like sort of route through the I don't maybe I misunderstood this, but the bean and deposit market to make the trade. Is that right?
Well, let's take an example where someone has some pods to sell for some worth of an additional, let's call it X% of the BDV in grown stock or in accumulated stock. In this case, I guess we're assuming that the person with the plots or the pods doesn't care which type of deposit they receive, although in theory that is another axis that they could specify on their order. But if we keep it to just some BDV and stock per BDV, you can effectively have the order be filled by any set of deposits that fulfill those parameters, if that makes sense. So what you really want encoded in the order is the ability to encode in an order, which the 1155 understood. In the case of deposits, is asset type, BDV, and stock per BDV, and then on the place in line. The question is around making it as simple as possible to abstract away down to the axes of the 1155 tokens themselves, such that when you're buying, you are really only interacting with the axis itself, which is the place in line. But when you're buying deposits, you're only really the acceptable asset types, the BDV that you want, and the stock per BDV, if that makes sense.
So is your point when you are buying some asset with a particular asset, that the asset that you're buying with, you sort of inherently don't care about some particular component of that asset? I don't know if that's really the
Well,
right way to word the question, but
it's really what the market cares about, right? Or you have some asset, some set of deposits, and you want some pods, under certain parameters. You are willing to list your deposits and exchange them for pods or for plots that fit certain parameters. So if someone now comes and wants to fill your order with pods, be willing to accept either the deposits that you are willing to put up for this, or some combination of assets that there is already liquidity for your asset. And that's really where the complexity lies. Because more trading pairs spin up, the question around aggregating the most efficient liquidity path such that you can match more and more of these orders together, even if there isn't a direct match.
But if you're the one initiating the trade, the asset that you're selling, the user interface could abstract away the properties associated with the 1155 that you're selling. Is that the point? Is that, I guess, one of the points? And I think that's sort of what I was asking. Okay.
Yes, listing certain deposits, and you're saying this is what I want for the deposit. Now, what the market views is sort of a different question than what the seller is willing to sell, right? So then when people are filtering to fill that order, they may want to filter the order based on asset type, based on BDV, based on stock per BDV. But beyond that, it doesn't matter to the seller. It only matters to the buyer. That's how it fits into like the user experience perspective. So here's the asset I'm willing to sell. Here's what I want for it. But the real point is that which angle you're coming at it from really does matter here. Because I'm just listing my deposits. But I'm not, particularly when you have assets that don't have they're not a single price is not real with. You're now matching sets of things. What the market is ultimately going to want to come to is some sort of prices, right? So a price for BDV, a price for stock, and that's why you will expect aggregation or multi-hop trades created to facilitate the most efficient exchange, because what the seller views as valuable versus what the market views as valuable are not necessarily going to be perfectly aligned.
I assume you'd still probably want some way for the seller to understand sort of the relative pricing around the, I guess I'll call it position or property of the asset that they're selling, right? That would still probably be important for me to see. If I'm selling pods for deposits, I would probably also still be curious, the pods maybe ahead of me or behind me have open bids at, I don't know, some price.
Yeah, but it's going to be that there are multiple axes, right? So there's some BDV, there's some stock per BDV, and then the BDV and stock per BDV that you can get for a given size will change in terms of the ratio. So in some cases, you'll be able to get more stock per BDV or vice versa, right? So it's around, as soon as dimensional assets, it's not so simple to give people a single reference price.
Right. There's two it's not a price. It's the BDV and the stock per BDV, which can be different depending on what the buyer.
Well, it's really two prices, and the point is that the way that the two prices are related changes. So don't necessarily expect there to be a linear relationship between the two. There may be, but you can't assume that.
With regards to the conversation about which trading pairs, like if we say, yeah, trading, plots for deposits makes sense. Like, what are all the additional parameters to figure out other than like which deposits? Like, is one of the questions to answer whether the plot holders should care or be able to specify how much stock per BDV, some threshold above which they're only willing to trade deposits for their plot? Or is the point that the market should be opinionated?
Right. Go ahead.
My final question was just, or is the point that the market should be opinionated and not allow a pot holder to specify that?
Well, there's a question. I feel like objectively the desired end functionality should be for markets to specify things like stock per BDV. It adds significant complexity. So
Not
it's a
sure if
question
it's just on
around.
my end, but I can't hear you anymore.
I could hear him. Might be you, Guy.
So to sort of summarize, it seems like being able to trade deposits for pods is like I don't know if we can call it low hanging fruit because it'll be complicated to implement, but certainly low hanging fruit from a obviously economically beneficial to Beanstalk to have. And think that some key points from this conversation are that one, you probably have to have stock liquidity before this market can become particularly efficient or abstract from a user perspective. Two, you could, in theory, have a deposits for pods marketplace where there's no consideration of stock whatsoever. And that would probably be a minor upgrade from the current pod marketplace, but not up to par with the full functionality. And there's some open question as to how to facilitate the most efficient and abstract interaction with the different axes around deposits. And maybe it makes sense at this point to sort of broaden the scope of the conversation a little bit and talk about what other assets are worth considering in this mix, in addition to pods and deposits. For example, some sort of Bean future or Bean deposit future or something like that, where there is some forward looking expected yield priced into current BDV. I think that's another very interesting market worth considering. Probably makes sense to have full spot markets before moving to derivatives, but feel like it's worth throwing it out there for this conversation. What are the other there's fertilizer, which hasn't really been discussed much. What are the other assets or things that it makes sense to build trading support for with regards to Beanstalk in the medium term, let's call it?
Would you expect there to be separate markets for a deposit marketplace versus like liquid stock marketplace?
When you say different markets, do you mean like a UX, a different UI?
Maybe is that the same thing? Or maybe I'm just like if stock is liquid, is that are you buying and selling deposits there? Or are you buying and selling like a ERC20 of a stock or something?
Well, in theory, you could do both once stock is liquid. There will be the deposits, which will be 1155s, which, as mentioned, are effectively the right to burn a certain amount of stock and seeds with the deposit to receive the underlying. And then you'll also have ERC20 probably stock, and then some sort of semi-fungible seed where the seeds are yielding stock based on the underlying asset that is deposited. Think that there's some work being done at the moment to like further abstract the concept of seeds. And so not exactly sure actually on the implications of feed liquidity thereof. And maybe Publius wants to comment on that, but to shed a little bit of light there. But the concept is, at least with regards to stock and deposits, there will be there will be the opportunity to exchange, or there should be the opportunity to exchange asset A for stock or asset A for deposits. And those are distinct things because stock and deposits are distinct things once you have stock liquidity.
This is maybe backtracking us, but I guess I don't really understand whether the takeaway was that a marketplace that trades deposits doesn't make sense until stock is liquid, or if some of that development work is, just additive. Like if we had the ability on the pod market today to just use deposited beans without any care for the stock or seeds, and then what work would be required after that to generalize it, if you will.
I mean, I personally would say, on the pod marketplace, right? The majority of, the major use case for deposits will be someone willing to buy pods with a deposit. And, the deposit or deposits that will be used will be known ahead of time. So it does kind of allow for, at the margin, some sort of arbitrary decision about whether to use, about whether to value the grown stock at all. Don't think, it's necessarily going to be the case that, kind of the smart contract needs to make assumptions about the grown stock. Kind of from the fulfillment side, if someone is willing to sell a plot for a deposit, I would expect the, maybe, they input some grown stock price, but, think that's much more less of a use case that for, deposits than it is now, or then the alternative where it's people buying plots with deposits. On the deposit marketplace side overall, think there's going to be value in the short term with unripe deposits, being able to put those on some sort of marketplace that people can buy and sell. But, kind of agree with Publius in a sense that, these markets are not going to be fully efficient until there's some sort of stock liquidity. But I would argue that even before that, there's still plenty of utility to be realized through enabling deposits in this marketplace, namely the, ability to create orders to buy plots with deposits. If someone's selling a deposit for beans, if someone is selling a plot for beans, there's already the option to, through pipeline, do, a withdraw and purchase. And, imagine that the majority of people trying to sell plots are trying to, exit their position instead of transition their position to a silo position. And thus it's like, kind of, I don't see much demand for trading plots for deposits on, by, through order creation there. But there is the big point to be made around the specific deposit marketplace, in that, unripe deposits will certainly be something that would be great to, allow the permissionless trading of. It just should also be noted that once deposits have an 1155 standard, they will be on OpenSea at least. So people will be able to, trade ERC for 1155 on OpenSea, just without the use of any sort of pricing function.
So that would be the advantage of a bespoke market for unripe deposits, is the pricing function.
Yeah, which, quite frankly, isn't very large. I mean, these OpenSea markets are not going to be able to be denominated in Bean, and I think some investigation was done at some point, and imagine it would be quite a substantial, kind of campaign in order to get Bean on OpenSea. So, kind of a deposit marketplace would also allow these transactions to happen in Bean and through the Bean website. OpenSea used to have a 2.5% fee, which is quite substantive, but I think they've since reduced it to like a 0.5% fee. I might be wrong. But kind of, yeah, regardless, like the standard 1155 ERC20 case is kind of already handled through Seaport or OpenSea.
Yeah, I forgot about the denominating in Beans part. That's a great point.
I think it is worth sort of thinking from an economics perspective about what's likely to have the most impact on Beanstalk, and facilitating a deposit marketplace, even just deposits for ERC20s, and that can be unripe and ripe deposits, and then potentially also getting it to be deposits for pods. That seems to be, at least on this end, where there's clearly the highest leverage and the probably a path forward. The question then becomes around the integration on Stalk, and potentially seed liquidity, and how that fits into all of this, and how to make seeds liquid, stock liquid, in whether or not stock should be divided into governance tokens and age tokens and interest tokens, or how exactly to facilitate the most efficient markets around Beanstalk through these tokens, and how all that fits into the overall timeline for like which markets to roll out first. So, maybe an open question is, which has already been discussed sort of here, is how does the liquidity around stock and potentially seeds affect the creation of markets for deposits? And does one need to happen before the other? I mean, the most interesting angle on this front is, before stock is liquid, stock per BDV is really a bonus because the deposits come with the stock. Whereas after stock is liquid, the stock per BDV is really a penalty because the deposits do not necessarily come with stock. And that is then there is some additional complexity on the UI front around, are you expecting to bundle the stock so that when you buy the deposit, you're buying it with stock or not? And it probably, particularly given that, the goal of this call is to orient around planning timelines, and timelines around specific products or exchange pairs, there is going to be a significant change on the UI level around supporting deposits after stock is liquid versus before. And so I'm curious for comments on whether it makes sense to do stock before, which is probably what it seems like makes the most sense, versus after.
And when you say
Yeah.
penalty,
Yeah.
that would be because the stock does not come with the 1155 token, and so the receiver of the token after selling their plots may have to buy more stock and seeds than they would have otherwise in order to liquidate their position.
Correct. So it's like if you thought, you're buying it for the underlying beans and the liquidation value of the beans, when you receive the deposit as it currently is constructed with the stock, you can then just withdraw and sell. But once the stock is liquid and distinct from the deposit, now you have the deposit, which is effectively the right to burn a certain amount of stock and seeds for the underlying asset that was deposited. At that point, the order for the pod, if it is just the deposit and there's no stock included, actually isn't worth what the underlying is worth, because you'd still have to go out and buy the stock in the market to get access to the underlying. So it fundamentally inverts the relationship.
And as time goes on, you would need a greater amount of stock to access the underlying in the deposit. Is that right?
Correct.
Would also just mention here that the nature of what's being transacted, is what the actual tokens that are being transacted are not as important from the perspective of if the deposit marketplace is assumed to be transferring stock and then stock becomes liquid, like some sort of orders created going forward could just include the transfer of stock and or seeds as well, and it could just be a marketplace. It's like a user has the option when they're transferring a deposit. Do they want to transfer the deposit including the stock, including the seeds, or excluding? So ultimately some sort of market that facilitates both those both those situations will probably in the long run be in order.
So is it fair to say from a development perspective, if this market was built on top of the 1155 tokens and then liquid stock was implemented, nothing in the market would necessarily have to change? It would just be the economics of the market that change at that point in time?
Yeah, and the economics of the market don't have to change if the market is adjusted to include, grown stock and grown seeds. Somehow there need to be some, cancellation event of all existing orders or something. But there's no reason why, sure, the economics of the market might change, or the order structure of the market changes so that it transfers stock and seeds and the deposit instead of just the deposit, which is assumed to include everything else.
Right, but the order structure changing would be development.
Yes.
Well, in that case, it doesn't necessarily sound like there's a cost to starting work on a deposit to plot marketplace before stock is liquid, even though the economics would change after that's implemented.
I think the point is there is a development cost, right, in the form of this new order struct and the aggregation of sending the stock and the seeds with the now deposit slip. So it would seem that it would actually be I guess from a UI perspective, like straight what the user is doing might not change, but everything else would actually have to change, it seems.
If we back out of the technical requirements here for just a minute and maybe think a little bit more about the product, I guess, do we have a sense for like how we would determine how many people, for example, want to trade liquid stock, or like what, to me, I think a lot of this makes sense in the world in which everything is composably tradable, but trying to think about things in terms of what actually, like, how do we measure market demand to be able to trade those sorts of different things in that manner.
I mean, I think that it probably can be intuited by where is the most inefficiency in the market. And from that perspective, right now, clearly there's a ton of inefficiency around deposits and the exchange of deposits, because if people want to exit the silo, there may be someone else that is willing to buy their deposit from them so as to gain the stock, or so the stock isn't burned. And that's probably the most glaring economic inefficiency in the system right now, and therefore there's probably the most alpha there, and therefore there's probably the most demand for markets on those assets, would be how I would think about it.
Makes sense. And I guess in addition, deposits being tricky to use in DeFi is like a second component of that. And, the pod market liquidity thing that we've discussed is a local, local example of that. But perhaps like making deposit in 1155 will help, for example, with the Seaport side, which obviously that's, a bit of a separate conversation. I guess like the reason I ask is because, it seems to me, at least at first glance, that if the goal is to reduce the friction around using deposits in the manners you described, then it probably makes less sense to start thinking about stock liquidity, because it's pretty clear that stock liquidity adds another degree of dimensionality, which, at least from a UX standpoint, seems to be something pretty tricky to solve. And so if the immediate problem is just being able to sell a deposit instead of withdrawing it, or use it as liquidity, or use it as one side of an order to do something, that seems to me to be a separate problem to an extent, and maybe we should focus on that and push the stock liquidity side down the road to when it's more clear that that's what the market needs to reduce it, or to improve efficiency, I suppose.
That's a great point, and we'll have to think a little bit more on where sort of the marginal inefficiencies lie, and whether that is more at the deposit level as a whole, or whether that is at the stock level. Yeah, this is a very fascinating point you raised, Chad. Curious for what other people are thinking about this.
Could you restate the point? Or one of you?
Yeah. So we talked for a bit about how making stock liquid, for example, would impact these markets. And I think I'm trying to zoom out a little bit and ask ourselves if it's worth going that many layers down the conversation here, or I guess my position is basically doing that increases the complexity of building an initial market to solve a clear existing problem, which is more or less that deposits are kind of stuck and can't really do anything. And I'm not sure how much adding stock liquidity to the equation helps solve that problem in the short term. And at least to me, I think the stock liquidity stuff is interesting in a theoretical sense and will probably have some applications, but does not seem to affect any of the more immediate sort of things that we can imagine.
Makes sense. And yeah, in addition, design and development of it is probably a ways out.
Question for the Solidity developers. How does implementing deposits as 1155s before stock and seeds become liquid, does that add any sort of complexity on effectively then changing what a deposit represents? Or, as you were saying earlier, Publius, would that just require some sort of one-time cancellation of all existing orders associated with those old deposit stocks?
Nothing changes from a development perspective. But I guess the transfer function would change in the sense that, now you transfer deposits that includes the stock and seeds. Once seeds are liquid, you transfer a deposit, it will not include the stock and seeds. So there actually is like some functionality difference there. It's hard to, it's going to take some time to think through all the potential ramifications of this. But it seems like at the surface level, if one just, if all the open orders are canceled and sufficient notice is given, it's, I would imagine it's not that big of a problem overall. Would also just say that the development of liquid stock is quite complex and, will probably be a multi-month endeavor from, the point at which it's seriously, that development is started at in some substantial capacity.
So then maybe in the short term, or the medium term even, the starting point should really just be around a basic implementation of deposits without stock and seed liquidity as an 1155, and sort of in parallel, potentially the development of pods as an 1155, and then the implementation of the ability to exchange deposits for ERC20 tokens first, followed by the ability to exchange deposits for pods. And none of this need include the complexity of stock per BDV, but can ultimately be added at the UI level at some point.
I mean, I would just ask the question, does it make sense to start with deposits for pods? And, kind of a combination of deposits and or beans for pods using the new market structure, given that, deposits will already somewhat be supported by OpenSea, or do we feel like, the marginal, kind of now this is happening on, the Beanstalk UI through Beanstalk technology denominated in beans, is that beneficial?
I think that ultimately depends on complexity around and timelines for the people working on this, whether it makes it easier to start with pods for deposits, which seems like it's the more complicated task, and then work backwards, or start with the deposits for ERC20 tokens and then add, the pod functionality after that. But, I think that's really more of an implementation question. Do any of the devs have the UI devs have thoughts on this?
Sorry, Pubs, could you reframe the question for me briefly?
Particularly, we're trying to get into the weeds on whether or not, the complexity of developing the deposits as 1155s without stock or seed liquidity against pods, and then working backwards to add deposits against ERC20 and pods against ERC20 is better, or it's preferable to start with deposits for ERC20 and then deposits for pods and then pods for ERC20 versus ERC20.
Great question. Thinking about that. At first glance, from a UI build out perspective, none of the three seems particularly harder, though I think on the margin, anything that's ERC 1155-ish will be comparatively hard, but all of them have that. So not sure I see like any particular technical angle. I'll think on that more. I think what that means is basically like, what's most useful to Beanstalk in the short term. And so I think that comes down to like the marginal, on the margin, the value of being able to trade deposits instead of withdraw versus like adding more liquidity to the pod market. So yeah, curious if other people feel that characterization is the same, and then also for the UI team, if you guys feel like that's a fair assessment.
So if we were to support the deposits for plots market, would that be in the structure that we had sort of discussed previously on this call about being able to define the sort of BDV of the deposit and the stock per BDV of the deposit?
I think it could start with just BDV to keep it as simple as possible, and then stock per BDV could be another axis added over time.
And so the consideration here is to sort of determine if it makes sense to build a native Beanstalk market to trade deposits when you can do that on OpenSea when deposits sort of match the 1155 structure versus building out the deposit market as a separate Beanstalk native market. Is that the right question?
Well, ultimately, there will be some sort of Beanstalk interface native way to exchange deposits and pods for ERC20 tokens. But yes, at the margin, once they're implemented as 1155s, you will be able to use OpenSea for those exchanges. And so there's a question as to, creating a new market, which would be deposits for pods first, and then working backwards to incorporate the ERC20 tokens, which are already supported on OpenSea, versus working forwards and just matching OpenSea functionality, adding the ability to denominate things in BDV, and then going from there, and then adding the deposits versus pods market. That's the question.
I tend to think it's the deposits for pods one, but yeah, curious how others feel.
Why do you feel that way, Chad? Just out of curiosity.
Yeah. Well, I think at first glance, so the pod market has pretty limited buy-side liquidity, and the pod market doesn't function nearly as well in a sort of manual, like trading OTC form. However, we've seen an unripe deposit market pop up that OTC, which, well, obviously like pretty janky for the purpose of at least trading unripe, which seems to have been the most common vector for this so far. Like it works. And so to me, that problem is like, it's not solved elegantly, but it is like possible. And I think probably the way in which adding, deposits, a market to buy and sell deposits themselves moving forward is to, add an alternate path when withdrawing, for liquidating your position. And frankly, not sure. I think it makes a lot of sense, but not sure we see like a ton of demand for that exact product right now. Though I guess we also don't have the data in terms of, who would be willing to purchase a deposit, under what parameters. But I guess that's my first thought. I think the second is that we've talked about both deposits and pods becoming ERC 1155s. And as I understand it, OpenSea for example, does a decent job of trading an ERC20 for an ERC1155. And the market cases of ERC20 for deposits and ERC20 for pods would both be fulfilled by that interface in the case where we make them both ERC1155 compatible. Basically, what I'm saying is like, to some extent, OpenSea has already done the work. And we could look at other marketplace UIs as well. So to me, on that front, like we should probably test the interest for those markets by making deposits and pods 1155 compatible, and then trying to encourage people to trade them on OpenSea if they so desire, and try our best to make the user experience as good as possible for those. For example, like we did, I think, a decent job with fertilizer of making it legible on OpenSea. It's tricky because of the way we do IDs, for example, for gas efficiency, kind of makes each individual fertilizer opaque. But adding metadata, custom metadata, and that kind of thing has been able to help solve that problem. So I would expect that we would want to do the same for both pods and deposits. But deposits for pods, which is like 1155 for 1155, I don't think, as far as I understand it, is nearly as well understood by something like OpenSea. And frankly, since both of those are so Beanstalk native, I think on the margin makes more sense to build our own UI around them rather than for any ERC20 token.
I think I generally agree that if you can already exchange deposits using OpenSea when they match the 1155 standard, I think probably right to start with the deposits to pods market. That's what I think.
+1.
So as of now, it seems like the consensus opinion, if people feel just dissent, feel free to disagree, is to implement deposits and pods as 1155s and start with a deposit for pod marketplace and not include Stalk, and then add the Stalk functionality after the initial launch of the market.
Yeah, maybe that makes sense to me. I guess before we dig into a couple more details with our last 15 minutes, anybody else, any other thoughts on that front?
I guess I had a question around where the existing pod market fits into that and whether we just leave it be or do something else.
When you
Like,
say
does it
where
make
it
sense?
fits in, what does that mean?
Like, would it make sense to migrate? Well, that seems a little invasive, but what I was going to say is like migrate existing orders to like deposit the beans in the orders and, recreate the orders like as a migration. Like I'm asking like, what's the point of the existing pod market still existing, or like rather, I guess, more importantly, like the orders and liquidity on it once a deposit for pod marketplace exists?
Well, the short answer is there is none. The longer answer is that it goes back to the benefits of having orders on chain, which is the way that the current pod marketplace works. So if there was some sort of borrowing happening against pods with liquidations happening on chain, it may make sense to revert back to an on-chain marketplace as opposed to an off-chain marketplace. But otherwise, there's no real reason why the current version should continue to exist per se.
But you're saying a version like a deposit plot marketplace that does exist on Seaport would not have that proof of liquidity?
Correct. So over time, it may make sense to try to implement something on chain, but that'll be much further down the road.
Another question. How does that relate to the person who wants to sell pods? Like, in a world where there is some need for the proof of liquidity, would there be some sort of incentive to sell on the on-chain marketplace versus the off-chain one? Or, because otherwise, why wouldn't everyone use the off-chain one? Even if some other protocol needs it or needs the
Well,
on-chain data.
this is not a question specific to the pod marketplace. The short answer is that there can be some fee charged by the person creating the order, or the wallet creating the order, for being filled through a liquidation, if that makes sense. So it's like this liquidity is being provided to be used for liquidations, and therefore if you're gonna, liquidate into this liquidity, you have to pay a certain premium, for example.
I see.
So like the order itself could encode some sort of VIG charged by the liquidity provider to compensate them for that.
Chad, I think you had something you wanted to say earlier. Didn't mean to backtrack this.
You're good. Lost the thread, but I think the existing marketplace question is really interesting. Maybe the other thing is, in the world I described where we're trading deposits for pods when both are 1155s, that off-chain order book, or the off-chain approach, would not, without additional work, support ERC20 for pods, as sort of, I guess that's implicit, but kind of made me realize that if we're only doing 1155 or 1155, for example, there wouldn't be a way to actually trade Bean for pods using the off-chain approach. So that's something to take into consideration and relates to the existing pod marketplace question, given that that's exactly what it does, even though it's on-chain.
I mean, to me, the two go hand in hand. Trading pods for beans and pods for deposit, should somehow try to be implemented as a singular market. As for instance, there'll be people wanting to sell plots for beans, and maybe that order will actually sell plots for deposits, and through pipeline then perform some sort of withdrawal and maybe even a sell. But it's like, to me, it's like the market structure should be done from the perspective of, it somehow supports orders of both, so that it can, kind of cross leverage, the use case for people wanting beans and the people wanting deposits.
And in particular, until the stock per BDV is added to the interface, which it doesn't seem like will be in V1, there is no difference other than whether you're loading up ERC20 beans or deposits. And, to Publius's point, it should definitely be abstracted away.
You're talking about from a UI perspective?
Yeah, the idea is that until you have stock per BDV, it's still just a bean denominated marketplace. So whether you're using ERC20s or bean deposits, you're still just denominating some sort of order in beans for pods, right?
Sure. So maybe let's go one step further and think about what the simplest implementation that takes Stalk into account looks like.
I mean, from people creating orders to buy plots with deposits, the stock's kind of already taken into account from a protocol perspective. But now it's like the user, if the user wants deposits, meaning they don't want to withdraw and sell or something, then they receive some sort of bonus stock for choosing this order over one that, say, uses beans. In the case where someone is selling a plot, then they would need to specify some kind of grown stock per BDV bonus, which basically would say, I'm willing to pay some number for some bonus grown stock instead of, just taking into account the BDV.
I mean, not to add too much complexity to this, but could see over time some sort of like stock per BDV per place in line curve being made. So then it's like, in order for a given order to be filled, it needs to satisfy both a BDV for place in line and a stock per BDV per place in line. So it really be two values that need to be satisfied, and that would probably create the like an efficient market in this case. But that may be too complex for a V1.
Let's roll it all the way back though to, so the starting point is a deposit gets used to buy pods, and we completely disregard any concept of stock. So we're just looking at BDV. So that's sort of version 1, right? And I think like even that product is probably quite valuable given the ability to just use latent liquidity that's in the silo, latent deposits to place orders. So that's the first step in my mind. Then the second question is like, what is the simplest form of taking into account that different deposits have different amounts of stock relative to pods, and how could we, if we were to boil it all the way down, what would that look like? And that's probably relevant as well for the ERC20 to deposits side. So very much so. So I think that's maybe the question I'm asking is like, let's just imagine for a second we're placing an order for pods and you have a deposit, or I guess maybe the other way around. What do you envision the inputs to look like in the simplest form?
I think it'd be something like me picking from my set of deposits which ones I want to order with, and what place in line I'm willing to trade pods for those deposits.
And I guess additionally, maybe some sort of preference structure around, are you willing to sell any of them? Are you only gonna sell the earlier deposits first? Are you gonna start with the later ones, etc.?
Yeah, I was thinking about that. There's like partial fills are going to be a huge pain in the ass here. I'm actually not sure how Breen would probably know more about this. I'm not sure how Seaport handles partial fills in this kind of case.
So, yeah, I mean, so Seaport, yeah, I would be curious for that as well. It's my understanding that you can specify some kind of Merkle tree. I mean, everything should be flowing through pipeline, even if it's routing through Seaport. Still not completely convinced that Seaport's capable of doing everything that's required. And still a big fan of the, kind of think the tractor interface. It's going to be way, I think, cheaper and have less overhead. So, that's a whole separate conversation. But, would assume that we're operating in a world where there's generalized functionality, and if an order book doesn't support what we want to do, then it's not good enough.
Cool, but on the buy side, so I'm buying with deposits, buying some pods. I just pick the deposits that I am willing to spend. I pick a place in line. Any pod below this place in line is good to go. And then I maybe order the deposits. Obviously, this doesn't take into account some sort of like pricing curve across the,
you could do it even simpler though. You could condense stock per BDV down to a single value, and you could do that for both, sides of the market. So when you're selling, you're saying like, I want at least a certain amount of stock per BDV from the deposits that are buying my pods and vice versa. When you're buying and in theory constructing your set of deposits, those average out to some stock per BDV. So understand that it may not be the most efficient thing to send like a pro rata portion of all of the deposits, but think that there can be some optimization done on creating the most efficient combination of deposits that aggregate to the stock per BDV value that you chose. And that's probably
Yeah. That's helpful. I'm trying to imagine what that looks like.
so. Let's say that you have this variable. I mean, in theory, you could still have the static prices for the pod side of things, but that's like painful, particularly given the timelines on this. Like, we should be able to get some sort of variable pricing for pods. The concept is you've now got these curves for pods that aggregate to some, BDV overall, and then the only additional feature to include stock in the market is some stock per BDV value that when an order is filled, it just has to be greater than or less than, depending on the side of the market, the stock per BDV value specified in the order.
Yeah. Still having a little bit of trouble here, like envisioning this doesn't feel like the simplest form of making this happen to me. Maybe let's go to the user side. Like what Guy said earlier in terms of just like picking deposits and then
When you
setting
say
up.
this, do you mean including the variable prices for pods or not?
So, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but there's kind of two dimensions of additional pricing. One is a varying price for pods based on place in line. And then the second
Correct.
is including stock in the calculation, either like as some sort of threshold, right? Or as a variable, like a curve in and of itself. And
Correct.
correct me if I'm thinking of that wrong. Okay. So,
Those are like the 4 layers or the 4 tiers, you could call it. Static pricing for the pods per BDV. Then you have variable function pricing for the pods based on place in line. Then you have static stock per BDV, and then variable stock per BDV based on place in line. So they're sort of sisters, let's call it.
cool. Okay. So, I guess the point I'm trying to drive to is what's the simplest implementation of some sort of static inclusion of stock in the pricing model, much like we made.
Yeah. So the assuming you have the static or variable pod per BDV, let's call it. The point is that the order itself still has some BDV value. So the BDV value is, if you're ordering pods, you are putting up X amount of BDV in the BDV value, BDV in the order. And so you put up 1,000 beans or BDV in the order. The question is now you can add some sort of multiplier to it, where when you are, well, let's think about it from both sides. It's much more intuitive from the sell side, where you're selling pods and you're saying that you want deposits with at least 1.2 stock per BDV. So if your pods are being bought for 1,000 BDV, then you want at least 1,200 stock associated with those deposits, if that makes sense. So when you're placing an order to list, when you're listing pods, you can specify that you want at least a certain amount of stock per BDV. Now, when you are selling your deposits for pods, thinking out loud here, but to some extent, there's no notion of getting credited for the stock, but there is some notion around the stock per BDV on the order as a whole, meaning that if you aggregate two different deposits with different stock per BDV, it's obviously in the interest of whoever's selling into that order to take only if they're going to partially fill it, take only the deposits with the higher stock per BDV, and then leave the rest of your order with less stock per BDV remaining. And so I guess the point is that similar to saying how you're willing to pay a certain BDV per place in line, you could also specify that you're willing to pay a certain amount of stock, but no more than that amount of stock per place in line. So it would be a maximum stock per BDV, either as a static value as or a curve as a function of place in line, saying I'm willing to pay no more than this stock per BDV as a function of place in line, if that makes sense.
And this isn't the case where you're suggesting that I put multiple deposits in one order for some number of pods, and then it's like the deposits have different stock per BDV, and so I'm setting like a threshold basically.
Correct. So when someone fills partially, they can fill partially, but they can't extract more stock per BDV than you're willing to pay.
This only applies in the case where there are multiple deposits in the order, correct? Otherwise, it's like I'm kind of implicitly setting the threshold by only having the single deposit, which has a specific stock per BDV.
That
Am I
is
thinking
true.
about that right?
Yeah, but you have to assume that people are going to be putting multiple deposits in a single order.
Well, maybe from a UX perspective, it makes more sense to like combine the deposits and then list rather than having a bunch of deposits in the order.
Yeah, but then you literally take away this exact complexity. Like this is a benefit to the user, right?
Yeah, I guess also since this is all off chain, you could just place a bunch of orders with smaller amounts rather than having to. Because one thing that I'm trying to think through, I'm not even sure how you would do this. Is
No, I think the point is that's not how this works, because you don't have, the point is if you have two different deposits with different stock per BDV, they average to some value. You can't segregate them into two different orders with the two different stock per BDV and then still get the benefits of the average stock per BDV. Unless you're combining them in the order itself and then encoding some maximum stock per BDV, you don't get any of the benefits of the aggregation.
Yeah, having a little bit of a hard time following all of this on the buy side, to be honest. Maybe like if you boil it all the way down, more or less what I want to do is get more pods or get better pods because my deposit has more stock. Would you agree that that's like the simplest description? By better pods, I mean further up in line.
I don't know if that's one way to say that it will manifest, but the concept is that you want to be credited in some capacity for the stock, right? So the base implementation is we don't factor in stock at all. You basically don't get credited for stock. The concept is now through allowing the buyers of pods that have deposits to impose some parameter on the stock per BDV, you're basically allowing them to specify how much they want to get credited for the additional stock in practice. Because what you're really doing is imposing a maximum stock per BDV that can be taken for a given place in line. And that is what creates the limitation. Whereas before, it's like any deposit, whether it has a lot of stock on top of it or almost no stock on top of it, or a grown stock on top of it, we should say, what you're going to get credited for it is exactly the same. Whereas now you can impose a limit and say, this is the most amount of stock I'm willing to send in exchange for this pod, which creates more scarcity on the stock, and therefore you'd expect the pricing around the assets to start to factor in the value of the stock. So the idea is that the way the parameter itself plays out is there's some maximum stock per BDV you're willing to pay on your order. And then you can just load up your order with as many deposits as you want. And when it's filled, it has to be filled with some aggregate of the deposits or some combination of the deposits that have a lower average stock per BDV than the maximum in the order.
Cool. Trying to draw some of this out while we're talking, just to visualize a little bit. So sorry if I go quiet. Curious if anybody else has thoughts.
Could you speak a little bit about the aggregation of the deposits and why that happens, I guess?
Because you have deposits that have different stock per BDV and need to be combined in such a way where they have enough BDV to fill the order, but not enough stock per BDV to violate the maximum stock per BDV parameter.
Can you repeat that?
So the basic idea is that when you have a set of deposits that have different stock per BDV and you put them in an order, and you've said there's a maximum stock per BDV that I'm willing to pay for any of these pods, the idea is that when the order is filled, the deposits that are ultimately exchanged can be any set of the deposits that fill the two parameters specified in the order, which is that you're paying enough BDV for the pods and that you're not paying too much stock per BDV for the pods. And so to some extent, whoever is filling the order can choose, potentially can choose the set of deposits that they want to draw from the order that fill those parameters. And, you know, to some extent, it's up to the UI to either abstract that away from the users or to allow them the opportunity to customize the deposits they receive. But because you have deposits with different stock per BDV ratios, you're ultimately going to need to create some sort of aggregation or combination within the set of deposits in the order, unless you're going to fill the entire order and take all the deposits.
For what it's worth, I'm not sure that partial filling is going to be. I think partial filling is going to significantly complicate the engineering. So, like in this example, somebody creates an order, they put 10 deposits in it for some number of pods, and then a partial fill would constitute me looking at the order, seeing that there's some deposits in it and picking a couple of them and then executing it sort of halfway. So now like 6, the other side, the user on the other side holds 6 out of the 10. The problem is that we now have to index that this is, like, I'm not even sure how we would go about indexing a partially filled order, because it would require us to have parsed the order to the extent that we know we're able to track like the user's deposits individually rather than statically checking to see if the order is fulfillable in aggregate, for example, which was kind of the original idea for, at least on my end, for simplifying the process. So I think that, yeah, all that to say, I think the indexer gets much, much harder in the partial fill scenario. And I bring that up not to say we shouldn't do it, but just to say, curious if we can think of ways around that problem. In particular, since when we, one of the constraints that we've kind of lifted by moving things off chain is just making it much cheaper to create orders.
All right, so we're about 15 minutes over at this point. It seems like the first market to really focus on is some pods for deposits market, and there are open questions around the complexity in terms of stock per BDV and partial filling and the complexity thereof. But otherwise, it does seem like there's some sort of consensus on the first market to work on and how that relates to the implementation of the pods and deposits as 1155s, which would have to happen first, and stock and seed liquidity should happen after. And that seems to be where we're at. Is that correct?
I think that's our analysis.
So it probably makes sense to have another dev call on this specific market at some point in the near future, but I feel like this was a very exciting and productive call.
Agreed. And just for everyone's reference, we're not going to have one of these dev calls on Thursday, given that various folks will be at ETH Denver, but we'll continue these next week on Tuesday and Thursday. All right. Thanks everyone for coming.